If you think the Middle East is just going through another round of tension, another predictable cycle of diplomacy and conflict, you are missing the single most consequential geopolitical shift of the last decade. And if you scroll past this without understanding what just happened, you will be caught completely off guard by what comes next. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I am going to show you a power map that has been quietly redrawn while most of the world was looking elsewhere. If this kind of deep analysis is what you are looking for, hit like and subscribe right now, because this is exactly what we do here, every single video. In this video, we are going to answer 3 questions. Why has a new shadow alliance formed in the Middle East? Who benefits from the collapse of the old power structure? And what are the 2 or 3 most likely scenarios that play out from here, including one that almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about? Let us get into it. The headline you are seeing across the news right now says that regional tensions are escalating, that a new alignment of powers is forming, that the old order is fracturing. But here's the problem with that framing. It treats this as a sudden development. It is not. What we are watching right now is the final, visible result of a structural shift that has been building for at least 4 years. The match was not just lit. The room has been filling with gas for a long time. What just happened is that someone finally struck the match. Let us zoom out. After the Abraham Accords in 2020, the dominant Western narrative was that the Middle East was slowly normalizing. That economic pragmatism was winning over ideological conflict. That Israel and its Gulf neighbors were quietly converging. That the United States, even as it reduced its military footprint in the region, still held the essential architecture of influence together. That narrative was always incomplete. And now it is effectively broken. What the media is covering is the visible output. New partnerships, unusual diplomatic meetings, defense agreements signed outside of traditional Western frameworks. What the media is not covering is the structural engine underneath all of it. A fundamental realignment of who the regional powers believe will protect them, what currency they are comfortable holding, and which external guarantor, if any, they still trust. That is the real story. And that is what we are going to map out right now. Let us run the power map. There are 4 actors that matter most in this new configuration, and every single one of them is operating with a public position that is significantly different from their actual strategic need. Start with Saudi Arabia. Publicly, Riyadh is maintaining its partnership with Washington. The defense agreements are still on paper. The oil relationship is still nominally intact. But what Saudi Arabia actually needs right now is something the United States has repeatedly failed to deliver. A credible, unconditional security guarantee. The Abraham Accords era gave Riyadh the hope that normalization with Israel, backed by American support, would create a stable security umbrella. That hope has been badly damaged. Saudi Arabia's biggest constraint at this moment is domestic. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman needs to show his population and his internal power base that the kingdom is not dependent on a single external patron. That vulnerability is what is driving Riyadh toward hedging, maintaining U.S. ties on one hand while quietly deepening relationships with China, and now signaling openness to a broader regional framework that does not have Washington at its center. Now look at Iran. Publicly, Tehran presents itself as the axis of resistance, the counter-imperial force, the ideological anchor of a bloc that includes Hezbollah, the Houthis, and allied militias across Iraq and Syria. But what Iran actually needs is economic relief and strategic depth. Sanctions have gutted the Iranian economy. The population is restless. The currency has collapsed multiple times in the last 5 years. Iran's leadership knows that military posturing is not a sustainable long-term strategy. It is a holding position while they wait for a diplomatic opening or a shift in the external environment that reduces pressure. Iran's biggest constraint is that its regional proxies are expensive to maintain and increasingly unpredictable. The Houthis, in particular, have demonstrated that proxy forces can take on a strategic life of their own that even Tehran cannot fully control. So Iran is at once more powerful in terms of regional reach than it has ever been, and more fragile internally than it has been in decades. Third actor, Turkey. Publicly, Ankara positions itself as a NATO member with Western commitments. Strategically, what Turkey actually wants is to be the indispensable swing state, the power that neither the West nor the Russia-China bloc can afford to alienate. President Erdoğan has perfected the art of extracting maximum value from strategic ambiguity. Turkey has sold drones to Ukraine while maintaining energy deals with Russia. It has blocked NATO expansions as a bargaining chip while never actually leaving the alliance. And now, Turkey is positioning itself as a potential broker in this new Middle Eastern realignment. A Muslim majority, militarily capable, economically significant power that can talk to everyone. Turkey's constraint is economic instability and the approaching pressure of its own electoral cycles, which force Erdoğan to balance nationalist sentiment with the need for foreign investment. Fourth actor, and the one that makes this realignment genuinely new, China. Publicly, Beijing describes its Middle East engagement as purely economic, belt and road investment, energy security, infrastructure. But what China actually needs from the Middle East is a demonstration that it can play the role of external guarantor, the role the United States has held for 70 years, without triggering a direct military confrontation with Washington. The Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization deal that China brokered in 2023 was not primarily an economic achievement, it was a proof of concept. Beijing showed every regional actor that it could deliver diplomatic outcomes that Washington could not or would not deliver. China's constraint is that it does not have the military infrastructure in the region that the US has. No equivalent of the Fifth Fleet, no network of bases, no decades of military relationship building. So China is doing something very deliberate. It is building influence through economic dependency and diplomatic credibility, while carefully avoiding the kind of military entanglements that bogged the US down for 20 years. Now let us look at the structural facts, the hard, non-emotional realities that constrain what can and cannot happen, regardless of what any leader says in a press conference. Structural fact number one, the petrodollar system is under more pressure than at any point since 1973. For 50 years, the foundational bargain of Middle Eastern geopolitics was simple. Gulf states sell oil in dollars, recycle those dollars into US Treasury bonds and American weapon systems, and in return, receive a US security umbrella. That bargain is visibly fraying. Saudi Arabia has now conducted oil transactions in Chinese yuan. The Gulf Cooperation Council has discussed creating its own currency settlement mechanisms. This does not mean the dollar is about to collapse. That framing is too dramatic and too simple. But it does mean that the automatic assumption that Gulf wealth will continue to flow primarily through American financial architecture is no longer valid. That is a structural shift, not a news cycle. Structural fact number two, the United States has significantly reduced its military presence in the Middle East, and the regional actors have noticed. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, the reduction of forces in Iraq and Syria, the political exhaustion in Washington with open-ended military commitments, these have created a perception gap. Regional powers that once counted on American military intervention as a backstop are now actively calculating what their security looks like without that backstop. This is not an anti-American argument. It is simply an observation about how rational actors behave when their threat environment changes. When the guarantor becomes less reliable, you find new guarantors or you build your own capacity. That is what we are watching. Structural fact number three, Israel's strategic position has been fundamentally altered by the events of the last 18 months. The October 7th Hamas attack and the subsequent Gaza conflict did not just create a humanitarian crisis, they shattered the core premise of the normalization strategy. That premise was that economic integration and security cooperation between Israel and Gulf Arab states could proceed on a track largely separate from the Palestinian question. That premise is now politically untenable in every Arab capital. Whatever the next phase of Middle Eastern diplomacy looks like, it will have to address the Palestinian dimension in a way that the Abraham Accords era consciously avoided. This changes the geometry of every possible new alliance configuration. Structural fact number four, energy markets are no longer a simple Saudi-OPEC story. The rise of American shale production fundamentally altered the supply equation. The green energy transition, however uneven and contested, is introducing long-term uncertainty about oil demand. Gulf states know that their economic window, the period during which oil revenues can fund national transformation, is finite. That urgency is reshaping their diplomatic calculations. They cannot afford to be locked into a single patron relationship for the next 30 years if that patron's own energy landscape is changing in ways that reduce the strategic importance of Gulf oil. Now let us run the scenarios. From where things stand right now, there are three distinct paths this realignment can take. And the one that gets the least attention is arguably the most consequential. Scenario A is the escalation path. If the new shadow alliance, which at its core involves deepening coordination between Iran-aligned forces, Turkish regional ambitions, and Chinese economic architecture, with Gulf states hedging ambiguously alongside, If this alliance begins to formalize and gains the visible endorsement of Riyadh, then the United States faces a genuine strategic crisis in its most important external energy region. In this scenario, American military assets in the region become exposed rather than stabilizing. Every U.S. base in the Gulf sits in a country that is now playing both sides. The pressure on Washington to respond, either by recommitting militarily or by accepting a diminished role, becomes acute. This path likely runs through a specific trigger, a major energy disruption, a direct military confrontation involving Iran, or a high-profile diplomatic move that forces Gulf states to publicly choose sides. Watch for emergency GCC summits called without U.S. participation, or new defense agreements signed between Gulf states and non-Western powers. Those are the early signals that Scenario A is activating. Scenario B is the managed fragmentation path, and this is what markets are currently pricing in. In this scenario, the realignment continues, but at a controlled pace. Gulf states maintain their formal Western partnerships while expanding relationships with China and building intra-regional frameworks. The United States accepts tacitly that its era of dominant unilateral influence in the Middle East is over, but retains significant economic and military relationships that prevent a clean break. Israel recalibrates toward a more transactional regional role, trading less on normalization optimism and more on hard security cooperation with individual partners. This path is messy, inconsistent, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wants a clear narrative. But it is also stable enough that a full-scale geopolitical rupture is avoided. The stabilizing condition for this scenario is that no single flashpoint, Iranian nuclear escalation, a Gulf military confrontation, a total collapse of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, forces the hand of the fence-sitters too quickly. Scenario C is the one that almost nobody is discussing, and it may be the most significant in the long run. This is the Turkey pivot scenario. If Ankara decides that the strategic and economic benefits of serving as the primary bridge between the new Middle Eastern alignment and European markets outweigh the risks of further straining its NATO relationships, Turkey effectively becomes the architecture of the new order. Turkish-mediated financial flows, Turkish diplomatic cover, Turkish military relationships with multiple sides simultaneously. This turns Erdoğan's strategic ambiguity from a tactical maneuver into a structural role. The wild card that could accelerate this, if the European Union, increasingly anxious about both U.S. reliability under shifting administrations and Russian pressure, begins actively courting Turkey as an energy transit and security partner. That would give Ankara leverage it has never had before. Watch for EU-Turkey energy infrastructure announcements or a formal reopening of accession discussions as the early signal here. Now let us bring this home, because this is not just a story about foreign capitals and diplomatic meetings that feel distant from your daily life. This hits Americans, and frankly, anyone in the Western world, directly and personally in several ways. The most immediate is energy prices. If the Middle Eastern power map has genuinely shifted, and if Gulf states begin to coordinate oil production decisions through frameworks that do not prioritize Western consumer interests, then the era of relatively predictable OPEC plus dynamics ends. What replaces it is a more fractured, more politically driven energy market. For Americans at the gas pump, for businesses calculating logistics and heating costs, for the Federal Reserve trying to manage inflation, a less predictable energy market is a more expensive one. The shocks could be sharper and the recovery slower. The second impact is financial market exposure. The United States has trillions of dollars of economic relationships woven through Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, defense contracts, infrastructure investment, and financial services. If the realignment accelerates and Gulf sovereign wealth, the massive pools of capital held by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait begins to diversify aggressively away from dollar-denominated assets toward Chinese yuan-denominated instruments, toward intra-regional investment vehicles, toward gold and commodity-backed holdings, the effect on U.S. Treasury markets is not trivial. It does not happen overnight, but a gradual shift in where Gulf petrodollars flow has meaningful consequences for U.S. borrowing costs, for equity markets, and for the dollar's reserve currency premium. The third impact is defense industry and geopolitical positioning. The United States has long funded a significant portion of its defense industrial base through arms sales to Gulf states. If those states begin diversifying their weapons procurement toward Chinese systems, toward Turkish drones, toward indigenous production, American defense contractors lose a major revenue stream. And more importantly, American military planners lose the interoperability and influence that come with being the primary arms supplier to a region. This is a slower moving effect, but it compounds over time. For viewers in the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, the implications run through the Five Eyes intelligence framework. A Middle East in which U.S. influence is more contested is a Middle East where Western intelligence coverage becomes harder, where friendly regimes become less forthcoming, and where the assumptions that have underpinned counterterrorism cooperation for 20 years need to be revisited. It also runs through trade. Australia's economic exposure to China means that any US-China competitive dynamic playing out in the Middle East has ripple effects for Australian strategic positioning. Canada faces analogous pressures, particularly around energy. A Canadian economy that is trying to expand its LNG export capacity into Asian markets needs to understand how Middle Eastern energy politics affects the price signals and political reception of that expansion. Here's my read on this. In the next 30 to 90 days, the surface story will continue to be military and diplomatic. Headlines about troop movements, statements from foreign ministries, emergency UN sessions. That is the noise layer. The signal layer, the one that actually determines the shape of the next decade, is financial and structural. Watch where Gulf sovereign wealth moves. Watch whether Turkey and the EU open a new formal dialogue track. Watch whether China makes any further moves to institutionalize its 2023 diplomatic breakthrough into something with permanent architecture, like a formal China-Arab states security dialogue or a yuan-denominated oil settlement mechanism with a second Gulf state beyond the pilot transactions already completed. My prediction is this: the old Middle Eastern power map, the one centered on American security guarantees, petrodollar recycling, and the assumed convergence of Gulf Arab and Israeli interests, is not going to snap back. It is not a temporary disruption. What we are watching is a genuine structural transition, and the endpoint is a multipolar Middle East in which no single external power holds dominant influence. Gulf states operate with far greater strategic autonomy than at any point in modern history, and the next major regional crisis is managed through a framework that looks nothing like the diplomatic architecture of the last 50 years. Short term, the headlines stay dramatic. Long term, the real battle is for the financial and institutional infrastructure of the new order. And that battle is already underway. Do not follow the headline. Follow the pattern. The pattern here is unmistakable. Power is dispersing, old guarantees are losing their credibility, and the actors who move earliest to build new relationships on their own terms are the ones who will define the next era of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The United States still has enormous assets in this region. Military, financial, technological, diplomatic. The question is whether Washington can adapt its strategy fast enough to compete in a genuinely multipolar environment, rather than continuing to operate as if the unipolar moment of the 1990s and 2000s is still the baseline reality. That adaptation has not happened yet. Whether it does is the most important geopolitical question of the next 5 years. News changes fast, structures change slow. Know the difference. That is what this channel is built on. Not panic, not hot takes, not reactions. Pattern recognition, strategic clarity, the next move before it happens. If that is the kind of analysis you want in your feed, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because the next video in this series is going to go even deeper on the financial architecture of this new Middle Eastern order, and you do not want to miss it.